About 4 billion years ago, Earth developed life. We aren't sure exactly when it happened or the specifics of how, but since then things have gotten a little crazy. There are now billions of species on Earth. But what is a species, and how do we tell species apart? And where do new species even come from? Let's find out. A species, as defined by the Cambridge Dictionary, is a set of animals or plants in which the members have similar characteristics to each other and can breed with each other. A somewhat simple definition, and one that mostly works, but if you've watched this channel before, you know that science is never quite as simple and neat as we want it to be. We'll get more into that later, but first, let's talk about speciation. Speciation is the process of a new species evolving, and the first kind of speciation we're going to talk about is allopatric speciation, or geographic speciation. This is probably the most straightforward form. Basically what happens here is that some kind of barrier splits a population in two, and then due to different conditions on either side of that barrier, those two separate populations take different evolutionary routes. This geographic barrier can happen a number of ways: continents splitting, mountains rising, or, in my favorite example, canyons forming. About 10,000 years ago, there was a group of squirrels living on the Colorado River. They would cross the river freely and inhabited both sides of the Grand Canyon. But eventually, something happened that stopped them from crossing the canyon. Now, I wasn't able to find a definitive reason. It could have been that the canyon got too deep, or maybe the river was too wide. But whatever the reason was, about 10,000 years ago, the population split into two and became isolated from each other. The north and south sides of the canyon have a few differences in climate and local wildlife, so as the years went on, the two populations started to diverge more and more. And now we have two completely separate squirrel species: the Albert squirrel on the south side and the Kaibab squirrels on the north. They no longer interbreed and have distinct features from each other. They're each their own separate species. Let's get more into what a species actually is. The definition has changed a lot over the years, and how we differentiate species has changed a lot as well. Currently, the main tool that we use to distinguish between different species is by genetics. But in the past, we would make the distinction based on habitat, looks, or even diet. If the same species was present in multiple areas, we would have considered that different subspecies, or possibly a different species altogether. But now, with genetic analysis, we know that isn't always the case. The history of taxonomy is pretty complicated, and as our understanding of evolution and genetics has deepened, we've had to revise the tree of life multiple times. I think the best example of how weird taxonomy can be seen in two different animals. The first animal I want to talk about are dogs. They are a pretty varied species. You have tiny little Chihuahuas and massive Great Danes. Wolves are the same species too. Now, granted, wolves and domestic dogs are different subspecies, but they can still interbreed, and that's how you get wolf dogs. Now, it might be more difficult for certain pairs to interbreed, but the point is they are all genetically compatible and would produce viable offspring. And so the huge variety of domestic dogs and wolves that we have are all one species, despite how different they look from each other. Now, the other animal I want to talk about are called dik-diks. These little guys are all different species. They are small herbivores that live in eastern Africa, and while they can technically interbreed, their offspring would be sterile because they would actually be hybrids. They're so genetically different from one another that they are all considered different species, even if they don't really look it. So, to me, these examples kind of prove the weirdness of taxonomy. The dik-dik all kind of look like they should be the same species, but they're not. whereas dogs have a huge variety, but they are all the same species. Let's talk about hybrids a little bit more. So a hybrid is when two different species are bred together and it makes something new. Hybrids are usually sterile though, so they can't mate and they aren't really considered their own species, except for the ones that can mate and the ones that are considered their own species. Remember how I said science isn't really as simple and neat as we want it to be? Well, this is it. So the most common example of a hybrid is a mule. It's the combination of a male donkey and a female horse. If it's a male horse and a female donkey, it's called a hinny, by the way. Anyway, mules are hardier and live longer than horses, but they have the obedience and intelligence of a horse, so they're great animals for really any kind of physical labor. The problem with mules, though, is that they're sterile, usually. So getting new mules always requires a male donkey and a female horse. They're sterile because horses and donkeys have different number of chromosomes. Horses have 64 chromosomes, while donkeys have 62. The difference in chromosomal numbers results in meiotic failure, and we can get more into cell division in a different video, but long story short, because there's a chromosome with no partner, it messes up the whole process of meiosis, so mules can't produce reproductive cells. There are a lot of cool hybrids out there, by the way, like zonkies and wolfins and ligers. I don't really have much I wanted to say about those. I just wanted to mention them and show you some pictures of some of these weird animals. Anyway, a hybrid are often named with the first part of the name coming from the male animal and the second half coming from the female animal. That's why a male lion mixed with a female tiger would be called a liger, but the other way around, it's a tigon. Ligers and tigons are pretty similar, though. There are some cases where hybrids can actually reproduce. If the two parents are close enough genetically, they can produce a viable, fertile offspring, such as Growler and Pizzly bears, the hybrids of polar and grizzly bears. Hybrids usually aren't considered to be their own species, but some are. Savanna cats are a mix of the wild African serval and domestic cats, and it is considered its own species. When the parents of a hybrid aren't close enough genetically, that's when you get sterile offspring. But sometimes female hybrids of these pairs can be fertile, like some of the hybrids in the genus Panthera. That's how we end up with liligers and litigons. So why are all male hybrids sterile while females sometimes aren't? The short answer is genetics is really complicated, but this video is supposed to be about speciation, so let's get back on subject. The other main type of speciation that we see in the wild is sympatric speciation. This one's a little bit weirder, but still a fairly easy concept to grasp. Basically, what happens here is that the subgroups of a population aren't split geographically, so they're still technically able to interbreed with each other, but for some reason or another, they don't. Sometimes it's a genetic shift that means that a subpopulation wouldn't be able to produce with the main population. But the most common example of sympatric speciation would be when insects become reliant on a different plant that grows in the same area. So the two insect populations that are of the same species would each kind of stay to the plant that they prefer and interbreed with other bugs that like that same plant. And over the generations, this would cause them to evolve in separate ways to the point where they would be separate species. Another interesting example is sexual selection. It's pretty widely known that birds can have pretty wild displays to try to attract a mate, but what happens when there's a split in preference? Let's say there's a bird population that likes to show off their vibrant colors, like the turaco. Specifically, I'm thinking of the Shallow's turaco. What would happen if some of the females start preferring birds that are a little bit bluer in color? Even if most of the population doesn't care, the preference of that small group can lead to speciation. As those females select for bluer and bluer mates, a subsection of the population emerges, those with really blue coloration. It would even be able to get so far that the main population would stop finding that subpopulation attractive because they're just too blue. However, as long as there is still that group of females that prefer to breed with the blue birds, we would see that subpopulation develop. And now the population would have a split. Those with the original green coloration and those who are a little bit bluer. They would stop breeding with each other and start to take completely different evolutionary paths until eventually they're different species. This whole time they were in the same geographic location and could technically interbreed with each other, but they didn't. But sometimes this process can kind of happen in reverse. Over time, two species can become one. More accurately, one species can kind of absorb the other one. Introgression, also known as introgressive hybridization, is the transfer of genetic material from one species into the gene pool of another by the repeated back-crossing of an interspecific hybrid with one of the parents. Back-crossing is just when the hybrid would breed with a member of one of the parent species. So a Li-Tygon is a female Tygon back-crossed with a lion. So if a population that consists of two species starts interbreeding, but they're consistently back-crossed with one parent species over the other one, then we would eventually end up, after several generations, with the donor species being fully introgressed into the recipient species. If the donor population was the entire population for that species, then it would become extinct while maintaining some of the genetic code in the recipient species. But if the donor population was just a small subset of a species, then that species would be able to be maintained while the recipient species would just become slightly more like the donor species. Another thing that can happen is that the trace of a donor species DNA remains in the recipient's DNA for basically ever. Through ghost introgression, we have species today that have traces of ancient DNA. One last type of speciation I want to talk about is synthetic speciation. This is pretty much what it sounds like, humans intervening to create new species. We've actually done this a lot, and if we hadn't, we wouldn't have things like cats and dogs, or corn, bananas, or really any modern farm animal or crop. Basically, instead of letting natural selection do its thing, we artificially select for the traits that we want. That's how we get bigger, sweeter apples, friendlier dogs, or bananas that aren't mostly seeds. But often with crops, we do this just to make different cultivars that aren't actually an entirely different species. We selectively breed or just propagate crops to develop a certain trait. That's what I do with the garlic that I grow. I only replant the biggest, tastiest cloves, and every year my harvest is a little bit better. And like many other crops, garlic has a lot of cultivars that are genetically the same, but look or taste different because we select for certain traits. The best example of this is broccoli, or maybe cabbage, or kale. Well, it doesn't really matter because those are actually all the same species. Brassica oleracea. This plant has 8 different cultivar groups, with each group having several different specific cultivars. So yeah, cabbage, broccoli, kale, they're all the same plant, as well as collard greens, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, and cauliflower. You probably noticed I didn't really specify what kind of cabbage or kale, and that's because it's all of them. Well, almost. There are a few that are other plants, like Siberian kale is a different plant, but for the most part, any kale that you're eating is probably Brassica oleracea. It's the same with tomatoes too. Pretty much every variety of tomato is just a cultivar of Solanum lycopersicum. By the way, tomatoes are a berry. which is a kind of fruit, and they're used as a vegetable. So yeah, they're all three. I don't even have time to get into the complicated world of plants. Anyway, I need to stop talking about plants before I go crazy. So let's get back to the original questions. What is a species? Well, it's complicated, but generally a group of individuals or populations that are genetically similar and able to breed and produce viable, fertile offspring. How do we tell a species apart? Well, these days it's mostly genetic, but in the past it was a lot more messy. And how do new species form? Well, through a process called speciation that can happen in several different ways, and that too can get a little bit messy. Now, honestly, there's more that I would love to talk about. Evolutionary biology is totally my jam, but I'm trying to keep these videos around 15 minutes or so that I'm able to process them and get them up in a reasonable time. If you liked this video though, check out this one I made about a new species of bacteria that evolved to live in space. But if you have more questions, you can leave them in the comments and I can address them in a further video. If you want to support the channel, the best thing you can do right now is watch my videos and like and subscribe. And if you made it this far, you already finished at least one of those. I'm also considering setting up a Patreon where I would post early access to scripts or maybe thumbnails, so I'm trying to gauge if there's any interest in that. So again, let me know in the comments. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and remember, stay curious.